Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast, the weekly podcast dedicated to conversations on faith and culture. This week, we have another great interview for you from Mona, interviewing community organizers Seth and Joe. They have really great stories to tell and also just give us some information on the work that they do. If you have any comments on this particular episode, you can do that at irenicast.com/54. And if you have any comments for the show in general, you can always do that at irenicast.com/feedback. We always welcome your questions, comments, and concerns. And finally, before we get into the interview, if you like what you hear, you can always support the show at irenicast.com/support. And there you'll see all the ways in which you can do that. So for this week, enjoy the interview.
So I'd like to introduce to you two of my friends who are professional organizers. Their names are Seth Woody and Joseph Sheeran. So I'd like to introduce you to Seth first, and I'll let Seth give you a bit more about his background. But Seth is a professional community organizer. Is that right, Seth?
That is correct, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.
So professional community organizer. Holy moly, what a title.
I'm excited about this conversation. I've been looking forward to this for weeks because I'm excited to learn more about this myself and just ask you guys the question, what the heck is community organizing? Why do we need it? Why do we do it? And how does it actually work? Because I think a lot of times it kind of stays in a hidden realm of work in the world. Is that kind of a fair way to say it?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to say it. I think, at least in my experience, a lot of times people hear community organizing and they think mainstream political organizing. And that is one of the things that I do and we do, but it's definitely not the only thing. And at least for me personally, it really comes out of my commitment to what I like to call the Jesus movement and my personal spiritual experience. Yeah, my commitment to justice and love. That's really, for me, it's an honor to be called a professional community organizer because that's where I think it's coming from.
That's awesome. So where do you work currently, or what are you working on currently?
Yeah, so I work for an organization called the Leadership Development Initiative, and we teach and train and coach mostly lay people in the Episcopal and Lutheran denominations in basic skills of community organizing. It's out of a tradition called the Gansian model of organizing. Who's this guy named Marshall Gans, worked with the farm workers out in California back in the 60s. And we teach 5 principles: storytelling, good team building, story and strategy structure, personal narrative, which is sort of our go-to, and then symbolic versus instrumental demands. So we teach folks in the church how to take these basic skills and apply them in their parish context, or apply them in a local political context, or apply them to their national denomination.
Wow, that's awesome. I can't wait to hear more about that. Before we proceed and ask questions about what all that means, I'd like to get Joe on here and introduce him. So let's say hi to Joe Sheeran, everybody. So Joe, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and what you're working on currently?
Yeah. So I'm currently in divinity school at Vanderbilt, and getting connected with some of the movement groups here in Nashville, Tennessee. So first off, I'm working with an affiliate of Interfaith Worker Justice down here called Workers Dignity. It's a workers center, so it's a place where an organization for workers to come together and organize and address a lot of systemic problems with employers in Nashville. In particular, there's a lot of what we end up doing is wage theft. So workers get their wages stolen from them one way or another, and then we have to figure out how to help them get that back. I use the word help. I really wish I hadn't, because it's really more about we work together to figure out, what is a way to do that, because it's really about empowering workers, and that kind of gets at some of the questions of what is organizing. And then other things I'm involved in, Surge Nashville, Standing Up for Racial Justice, which is kind of like it's a group of white folks working to raise racial consciousness amongst white people for anti-racist work. And then lastly, I'm working with an elected official in South Nashville and some community organizations there, like a community center and so forth, to try to build some neighborhood power, and especially overlooked neighborhood in South Nashville that I did some electoral work in. And while I was there, I said, it'd be really great to come back here and instead of asking people for their vote, to say, what are problems, what needs to be worked on, how can we be a place to convene that and start to ask those questions of what are our gifts and skills and how do we apply that. So that's kind of a nascent project that I'm working on as well.
Awesome. You guys both have your hands in a lot of different types of work, it sounds like. So I want to ask a question about what, we want to get to the central question of what community organizing is for those of us who don't have an awareness of it, because it tends to be, a kind of a hidden, I said earlier, sort of a hidden industry. I understand a lot of movements intentionally don't have charismatic front leaders. So you might not know that community organizing is happening right underneath your nose or in your community. So I want to ask that question, what is it? But before we do that, I wanted to ask about how you both got into this work, because sometimes we get into this work accidentally because we're just passionate about a project, and then we ended up learning about the larger picture later on. So for you, Seth, how did you get into this kind of work?
Yeah, I was studying theology at Boston College, and I had this great opportunity to live in intentional Christian community and learn about liberation theology in El Salvador. I went to a Jesuit university there for 6 months with a group of American students and Salvadoran students. And yeah, we got the chance to see this really beautiful witness of God's love in a country that has experienced a lot of economic marginalization and a lot of violence through a civil war. And people were motivated to do courageous acts of justice, and in a way that had no central leadership. And I was just totally floored by that. And I've kind of been following the bug ever since. I left school, lived in a monastery for a year in Cambridge, and tried to figure out how was I going to be a disciple and do the justice work that I knew needed to be done. And I got involved through a fellowship program called Life Together, where I met Joe, actually. And I got placed with an organization called the Youth Jobs Coalition, which was organizing young people of color in Massachusetts to gain full employment and resist mass incarceration. And it was there that I learned some of these basic principles, and I learned a little bit about the history of organizing and got really excited about, oh my gosh, not only is this a passionate thing where justice can happen, but it's also a school of thought. There's a craft, and I can belong to this community. And that was super appealing to me. And eventually I wanted to work more in my own context. So I took a job with Leadership Development Initiative and have been working with church folks, trying to get them involved in justice movements across the country, and really have an analysis about their own theology. Is God's dream possible? And if so, how can we organize ourselves and our neighbors to be a part of it? Yeah, so I love organizing. I think it's great. And there's lots of complicated stuff that goes with it too.
Yeah, it's amazing how the same sorts of principles or ways that you work can be tailored to different issues. So how about you, Joe? How did you get involved in this?
Yeah, well, just to start, I will say that it's been a long journey. I grew up in a kind of a bedroom community of Detroit, and the kind of lessons that I learned as a child are very much antithetical to what I believe now. So, first, I would say, of the set of things that were important was I spent some time on a reservation in South Dakota, which at the time, my reasons for going there had more to do with I want to get the hell away from everybody than anything else. But while I was there, I just became kind of aware of the fact that, this is a place where those things that I were told were true about the way that the world works and about, how you achieve success in our society break down. That was a place where our country had taken a whole group of people and said, you know what, you are going to live this particular lifestyle that you didn't come up with, that you haven't been living on this land that's not good for it. And we're, not really going to give you tools to do anything about that. So that was kind of a breaking things down moment. And then, like Seth said, we both were in Life Together. So shortly after being there, I came to Boston, and was assigned to my workplace. I ended up really liking it, but at the time was pretty unhappy because I had specifically tried to avoid working on this campaign to increase the minimum wage because I just wasn't sure about that ideologically, and then ended up getting assigned to it, and then ended up somehow being able to wrap my head around it with the help of some friends, and realized that actually this was what I needed to be doing, was to be doing that kind of broad campaign work. And then from there, after that was successful and I moved on to Nashville, I tried to recreate the same thing here in Nashville and realized that actually I wanted to go one level further than that, from kind of a campaign based model to more of a grassroots kind of thing, just because I just felt like that was a place where more change was happening and there was more work to be done. So, coming to Nashville, I met a handful of people through the divinity school that just really challenged what I was thinking. My response to the challenge was, well, show me what you're doing, and I'll try to figure it out and see if I understand it. And I can't say that I do, but I'm liking what I'm doing.
It's interesting you guys have some parallel stories, that you both had these really formative experiences in communities that were not your community of origin that raised your consciousness, and then you both came to the residency program and accidentally kind of got into organizing, which is what I hear a lot from people who start this kind of work, because most of us just out in the public don't know what organizers do. They might be familiar with the phrase. So that's my next question. What the heck is community organizing?
Beautiful.
Anybody want to take a shot?
I can attempt to answer that question, because truly my day-to-day seems very unpredictable. But I think at its core, organizing is about building relationships with people, and not just any relationship, but a relationship of accountability and of trust and of mutual alignment and support. And that through those relationships, we can build power. We can build the power to make changes in our local community. We can build power to change things in our church. We can build power to change things in our government. And with that power, we can implement the change that we want to see. So it's building relationships to build power to create the change we want to see in the world. I think that's one of the reasons why it's hard to identify what is or is not organizing, because so much of the world is actually building these social relationships to build the kind of power you need to make a change. And collectively, you could call those people organizers. Sometimes they're called something entirely different. But generally, when someone refers to a community organizer, they're talking about someone that's doing those things.
That's a good answer. Thank you. That's helpful. Now, just real quick, before we ask Joe the same question, a lot of times I think people associate power with something negative, but I understand that it means something very specific in an organizing context. Can you explained a little bit, but can you help us understand what that means?
Yeah. And this actually gets to a piece about the different types of organizing or different traditions of organizing. So in my frame of reference, I like to talk about a social view of power. And what I mean by that is that fundamentally, we understand individuals in a system to have the quote unquote power to consent or withdraw consent from the institutions that allow them to participate in daily life. So one could say in that context, power is really the ability to choose and the ability to enact one's belief in a public way. Now, sometimes organizers talk about a monolithic view of power. And power in a monolithic sense means that there's a hierarchy of means, and some have a lot of means and some have very little means. And power is really about, do you have the leveraging in a system to enact that change? So at the top of a monolithic system, you might have a pope or you might have a general. And these people have absolute control. And only by building enough power below them can you leverage your ability to enact the change you want to see.
That is interesting and very helpful. Thank you, Seth. How about you, Joe? What does it mean to you to be in community organizing and to do this kind of work?
I think what Seth has said about power really kind of hinges at it. Community organizing is about trying to create and collect power into a group to accomplish some goal or some end. So you can do community organizing for any number of goals, ideologies, whatever. Generally, when we talk about community organizing, we're talking about folks that are taking on a more liberative perspective, ideally, but that's not always the case. And the right wing has increasingly used some of these strategies in the recent years. But for me, when I think about community organizing, I think about a lot of folks talk about power, and they say you get power two ways. One is by organizing money, or to use Seth's words, means, and the other is organizing people. And so community organizing, for me, doesn't always exclude the organizing of money, but usually means the organizing of people in a situation where there isn't a concentration of money or means that's already pushing for that change or goal that you want to see. And so this is, the answer of folks who want that change but don't yet have the powers to go out and create that network of people to accomplish it. All those things that Seth said about accountability and stuff are important, and I'm not even going to try to achieve that level of eloquence. But I would say for me, it boils down to organizing people to counter the effects of organized money at times.
That it's really interesting that you brought that up, because I wanted to ask you both about this. I know a lot of people who are incredibly disillusioned at their ability or their power, their sense of power. Maybe that's a feeling of disenfranchisement or disempowerment, that we exist in a corporatocracy, in a society that is so run by big money that those of us who are in the grassroots level feel completely disenchanted with even concepts of democracy or being involved in any sort of social movement, So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. What does that look like to combat organizing that's based so much on money when you don't have any?
Yeah. I'd love to take a stab at that, because I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I think for me, it comes down to a truth that you already named, Mona, which is that a lot of people experience that disempowerment. A lot of people, pretty much everyone, experiences that disempowerment. And if we can build relationships with that multitude of people and say, hey, you feel disempowerment, guess what? I'm feeling that too. Also your neighbor, also their neighbor, also my mom, also my mom's brother-in-law. Everyone is experiencing that disenfranchisement. And it might look differently. It might take on different shapes. Some people might benefit, some people might not. But collectively, we're all experiencing that. There is such hope in that truth. We actually have all the people we need to build the kind of world we want to belong to. And I think it's really about combating this myth that there aren't other people out there experiencing that. So a lot of what I do is really just trying to speak to folks, particularly in the church, and say, we have a belief system that totally backs us up. This world is crazy. Big money is insane. It's evil. We have a belief system that says that, and we sit on our, pardon my French, asses and do nothing. We have an opportunity to claim our beliefs in a profound way, and that gives me a lot of hope. And as an organizer, it's always about, can we build that relationships where you and I can share our vulnerability, that we are disempowered.
That's awesome. I'm getting excited as you're talking. Yeah, we can do it, guys. No, I know that though this is so much more complicated than just getting excitement and mobilizing people out of a sense of charisma or out of a sense of urgency. I understand this is very much a long game and a strategic game of trying to navigate systems that are almost unnavigable. Yeah. Would you say that's correct, or would you change that?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And again, I want to lean on our tradition, man. We've been playing a long game. This is not what's going to happen tomorrow. And I think because of that, for me personally, that's why I try to emphasize this idea of targeting the public, of really building this social view of power. Because the long game is that we can actually just withdraw our consent. And of course, what that looks like is nonviolent resistance, and the system will respond accordingly. And we've seen that in history. And we need to build the kind of courage and relationships grounded in love and trust that are able to take that on, knowing the risks, knowing the costs. Yeah, I mean, we're a people of the resurrection. We're a people of the crucifixion. And that's a long game. That's a long game. But it does start with that heart experience, that excitement, that energy. This is possible. We can do it. And it's then, how do we translate that into relationships? How do we translate that into structure? One of the things I talk a lot about is, what does a truly decentralized structure look like? And I think a lot of people, they hear that, and what they translate it into is a system without order, chaos. And I actually think that's really underselling the power of decentralization. In my experience, decentralization actually requires more structure. It requires more understanding of the rules and the systems at play. An example, like Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the most decentralized organizations in the world, one of the most empowering organizations of the world. The 12 traditions and the 12 practices are truly beautiful and very simple and also very complex. And I think that's the kind of model of organizing that we want to live into.
It's nice to get that perspective. And I know we're talking in like kind of large abstract terms, which are hard for some people to grasp. So we'll bring it to the ground in just a moment. But Joe, I want to ask you about something you said a few minutes ago. You used the phrase movement group. And I wondered if you could flesh that out for us and help us understand what that means and what that looks like.
Sure. Before I get into that, I just want to suggest during the editing that we get some Hammond organ behind Seth on that last comment. That would just really make it for me.
It was pretty epic. It really was. You preached a little bit in there, Seth.
Sorry, I'm a preacher at heart.
Oh, don't apologize. That's great.
That's what we love about you, Seth. What was the question again? Sorry.
You use the phrase movement group. So I'm just trying to, for people who have like no concept of what this is, and are trying to get their minds around what it is. So you use the word movement group, and I was wondering if you could help listeners understand what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So movement groups. When I use the word movement groups, I mean, to put it plainly and unhelpfully, groups that are about the movement. Now, what I mean by the movement is admittedly a vague and general term, but I'm referring to that concept of, we are a disenfranchised people, all of us. That impacts us in different ways, but we share in that disempowerment that Seth was speaking about a moment ago. And the movement is, let's end that. Let's address class issues. Let's address race issues. Let's address oppression of folks of queer, sexual, and gender orientations. Let's address that. Why is this happening? Why are we living in a world where there are so many problems, and instead of taking it to the people that are at the top, the people that are creating those problems, we're angrily yelling at each other. So when I speak about movement groups, I mean groups like the Black Lives Matter movement, groups like Surge, groups like just a number of organizations, and some of them might not necessarily even see themselves as connected to each other, but they are. This is not a political ideology. I mean, in the sense of like, you won't find this on your ticket when you go to vote, but it is an ideology of resistance to oppression and wanting to change that. So when I speak about movement groups, I mean groups that are engaged. Some of them are engaged in community organizing. Some of them are engaged in just a smaller scale community organizing within themselves. I would argue that there is a consistency beneath all that, which is they're looking at how do we arrive at the kingdom of God. If I'm going to put my preacher hat on for a second. The kingdom of God is what I think movement groups are aiming at, although many of them would not use that word.
But there is a really strong tie between organizing, civil rights, nonviolent resistance, and preachers in particular. So I think there is as far as I understand, there's a tradition there that you're speaking to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is cool, which is very cool. And I think that tradition gets swept under the rug a lot. I'm really glad you brought up Black Lives Matter too, because I think a lot of us who if you're not really involved in that movement, or you're just kind of a sidelines person, like a supporter and ally, you don't realize that Black Lives Matter is a really intentional movement, that the organizing is incredibly involved and strategic and specific. And it, for a lot of us, just out in the world, we just see a hashtag and we think it happens by accident. And we don't realize there are people actually moving and shaking and changing and making this a public spectacle.
Yeah. Can I speak to that for a second, Mona?
Please do.
Yeah. I think when we talk about movements, and Black Lives Matter is one of them, United We Dream and the Dreamer movement for immigrant rights is another that comes to mind for me, or the climate justice movement. Sometimes it's very hard to remember that there are people behind that, right? We lose the agency of that individual. And a lot of times we tend to assign a certain personality to a movement. So when people think civil rights, they assign Martin Luther King to what the civil rights movement was. And they may not think of Ella Baker or Baynard Rustin or the countless thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that sacrificed to make those changes possible. And with Black Lives Matter, I think folks are again challenged to think in those terms. There's not a charismatic leader of Black Lives Matter. And so we see it and we can't identify its personality or what's true or what's not true. And that's one of the problems that the movement has right now. It needs to find a way to articulate itself. And I would just ask people to remember that it's human beings. I mean, these are folks in college. These are folks who have families that are giving up their lives and their time and sacrificing a lot of personal safety even to bring it to the streets and to bring it to our Thanksgiving dinner tables. And that's huge. And I think that you can see in that what we talk about when we say community organizing, the courage and the sacrifice behind these movements. That's the bread and bones, the bread and butter, the meat on the bones of what community organizing is.
So it's really interesting. You're saying this, Seth, and I've been thinking a lot about what it means to have sanctioned and unsanctioned spaces, and I'm kind of borrowing this from Kavanaugh, who wrote a book called Migrations of the Holy, God's State and the Political Meaning of the Church. I don't agree with everything he says, but he talks about, he kind of points to, this isn't exactly his idea in the book. I'll say what it is in a sec, but he kind of points to this idea that the way that we have been conditioned to think sociologically and socially about our social order and our systems and our government is that the sanctioned is in the impersonal spaces, the official spaces are the most important spaces, and the relational and the grassroots are unimportant or sidelined. And he makes a case for the fact that the church is the space for the unofficial to become sanctioned in a way that the state should not be able to sanction. I don't know if I'm making complete sense in that, but he says basically he equates the state with basically as like a telephone service provider who should not be responsible for making moral decisions. It's really up to the people and up to religious communities and other types of communities to inform the state and to demand moral action. But we can't anticipate or trust the state, he says, to mitigate morality on our behalf or to be kind toward us. Like, it's really our job to take that into our own hands. And I think that idea represents a huge paradigm shift for a lot of us. Especially I think for those of us who are raised with the idea that we should have a theocracy, that this should be God's country, that, Jesus should rule America. That's what I was raised with. And, not to knock anybody per se who still believes that, but, Kavanaugh's pointing to a really important distinction between the state and the church, that really as people of the grassroots, we have an existence that's beyond what the state allows us to be and sanctions us to be. That meaning is beyond our governmental structures. So I've been really moved by this idea. And so thinking about organizing in those terms, it's kind of like a reclaiming of humanity and meaning, and not letting, governmental structures determine every portion of our lives. What do you guys think about that?
Oh man, got me chomping. I want to say one thing, and I want to let Joe talk too.
Okay.
I think I got two minor things that I would contend in that, although I'm with the spirit of it for sure. One is that the way he's describing the state makes it seem like we don't have direct agency over what and who and how the state is, which we could if we decided we want to. And the second thing I'll say is to the point about theocracy. I would love to see what the world would look like if Jesus actually had moral authority over what was going on. Because whatever anyone has ever called a theocracy in the history of the world has paled to the real justice that I experienced from Jesus Christ. So while I'm not necessarily arguing for a theocracy, I do think a state that reflects the values of the real Jesus. And I think we can have a debate about what that is.
Yeah, what's the real Jesus, Seth? Please enlighten us.
Well, I'll say one thing
where
about
are the
the
dragons?
real Jesus. I'll say one thing about the real Jesus. In my experience, and I think a lot of people's experience, Jesus was a person of color who was born homeless to a homeless family, who was a immigrant and an undocumented immigrant at that, who resisted the political apparatus of the state and the church and was murdered by said institutions because of the way he behaved. That's my experience of Jesus, and I could make an argument that Jesus was queer, and we could talk about that later, but all of those things to me point to a very radical understanding. But anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent, and I want to let you
Well, I asked. I set you up for that. Joe, what do you think about that idea of sanctioned space, separation of church and state, and our role in navigating that?
Well, I would also say that with like Seth, I don't necessarily have a problem with the idea of the ideas of Jesus guiding how we do things. I just think that people take things that they want to be true and then ascribe them to Jesus. So, for instance, to your point there about the church as a venue to kind of how did he put it? I'm
To
asking
kind
you a
of
question.
to kind of reclaim sanctioned space and not let the state mitigate everything that we know as like credible. It's he's kind of writing in a philosophical plane, but
right. So in order to do that, you have to, as you pointed out, you have to break down a lot of things. The most nefarious things you have to break down is the idea that criticizing things and criticizing people, whether they're state officials or businessmen or your pastor, is somehow unchristian. That taking a strong stance on something and saying, you know what, this is not how I am called to live as a Christian, really rubs a lot of people the wrong way. Because as you pointed out, a lot of people have this idea that being Christian means being polite, and I would disagree. And so you have to get through that idea that you can in fact do that, and second, you have to get people the idea that it would work. So one of the things that I regularly come against in two different areas of my work, one which is organizing folks in a low income, predominantly Black community in South Nashville, that has repeatedly been overlooked by institutions with power in Nashville, is the idea that there is anything to gain at all. Because I think a lot of people at this point have been told no so many times, or they've been told, hey, let's get something together. And then the people invested in it turn out to have the people from the outside that come in to work on that turn out to not be what they said they were. This has happened so many times and continues to happen so many times. Eventually, you just get numb to it. And
can
then
you give us some examples of those things?
Sure. So we recently took a survey of how many groups are providing resources to this community, and we found that it was a much, much higher number than we knew. But so many of these groups are part of what could be termed the nonprofit industrial complex, which is, nonprofits that exist for the sake of, hey, aren't we great? We're doing something. Which is not to say that it's not that many nonprofits don't do things that are worth doing, but just sometimes there are broader questions asked about how is this making a concrete, sustainable difference that is hard to ask if you're, trying to continue to have a budget, get revenue from grants and pay staff and keep doing whatever it is that you're doing. those are hard questions to ask. The effect of that in my neighborhood has been that when I went around campaigning, I got a lot of people just saying, where are the candidates when it's not an election, which is a very fair point. And I made sure to listen to every single one of those sermons. And then, after the election, I had a lot of people telling me when I knock on their door and say, hey, we're interested in trying to start a conversation. Is that something that you're interested in? Like, what are things that you're frustrated about? A lot of folks don't want to engage in that because they're afraid that it will be a waste of time, because they've seen it be a waste of time so many times already. So you've got that kind of collective debris of folks who didn't follow through or had different intentions than they let on in the way of that can create problems. Now, the other side of my work is I work in kind of covertly, overtly, but I don't necessarily brand myself this way, but I work with Workers' Dignity to try to increase the number of faith allies that we have in Nashville. So I will go to a church and try to strike up some conversations and get some folks to come out and see if I can meet with the pastor and talk about, what is your church doing to live into these aspects of our vocation as Christians, and then to see if that is something that Workers' Dignity can make sense with. Most recently with that, I've been leading a lot of Bible studies at a wealthy mainline congregation in Nashville. And, it's not that folks don't see these problems. It's just that people are skeptical about their ability to change that, because they see the government as this thing that, has authority, is ultimately the only thing that's going to make the difference. And they, as Seth had pointed out, they don't necessarily see, if you get enough drops of water in a bucket, you're going to raise that bucket or raise the level in that bucket. And that's a hard shift to make. And I think a lot of people just find that really discouraging. And to that end, one of the things that organizing, when you're first starting out as a baby organizer like I am, is people tell you, make sure your goals are measurable and achievable, and they're little, but you can point to them and say, we definitely did something here. And it's like lifting weights. You don't start out doing a 400-pound deadlift. You start out with something else, something lighter. I have no idea if I've answered the question, but I've talked, so I'm going to stop.
Well, no, what you're saying is very fitting, because I think, going back to the theme of disillusionment that's been brought up a couple of times, first of all, it seems like it can be almost off-putting, like what you said, trying to clean up the mess after people who've gone ahead of you and have done a really crappy job, and even maybe made things worse by promising and not following through. But also just how hard it can be to bite off tiny chunks when there are these massively looming problems happening. And you can't do much about the big stuff, but you can take on these little projects, like you said. And that's, I think, where this strategy in the long game seems to come into play. But so I want to play devil's advocate for just a moment. That why? Okay, I feel even horrible just saying this. Okay, so pretend I'm not Mona for a minute. Pretend I'm somebody else. Why you guys just want to make the world about problems? You're just focusing on the negative. So go back to something you said earlier, Joe, that it can seem unchristian to criticize or complain, But I think those of us who walk around with a certain amount of privilege or accidental opportunity, we can't understand what it means to have a system that really not only doesn't serve our needs, but works against our needs actively, and puts us on trial, or, the myriad of other things. So I'm trying to talk about this in a little bit more concrete terms for those of us who are still having a hard time getting our minds around this. So, for example, why should we fight for a society where, everyone, despite their race or ethnic, origin, is treated equally and has the same amount of opportunity? Like, why should we care as people of faith? Is that a dumb question? I mean, I think a lot of people think that way. Like,
that's a great question.
Why should we be politically correct? Why should we try that hard? Like, I don't have that much energy to think about this that hard or work on it,
I mean, get back up on that preaching horse, but
do it.
Do it.
I think we've all seen those bracelets hopping around there. It says, "What would Jesus do?" I mean,
Mm.
we want to get down to basics. Why should we organize for a society in a world that all people are included, regardless of their cultural or racial or ethnic experience? I mean, come on. Is that even if you want to be about it and be a follower of Jesus, I don't know what to tell you. And as a human being on that level, yeah, I mean, relationships across difference are the most life-giving I've ever experienced. And they're hard. But I learn a lot more about what it means to be Seth, about what it means to be a fellow human being from people that don't experience the things that I experience. And I think that's why marriage is so important. This amazing experience to see someone who's different than you and learn about the world and see the world through their eyes for a lifetime. You learn for a lifetime. That's beautiful. So as a fellow human being, I would say it's just a better world that way, let alone the rational concepts of justice. And why would we organize for a world that includes, now that we've had 500 years of exclusion and colonization and white supremacy and the destruction of indigenous people? And I feel like every angle you look at it, except for one that has no critical analysis whatsoever, there's a reason.
It seems like in this case that when we capitulate to the individualism of our day, if we stop being countercultural as people of faith, if we allow ourselves to become apathetic, we really, by doing nothing and by being quiet, we really actually are on the side of those who are doing bad things. Like, I can't say it any more simple than that. If you don't at least cry out about Flint and the water in Flint, Michigan, if you don't say something, you are actually working on the side of people who are abusing others, So
totally.
It's hard for us, though, to wrap our minds around that when we've been so conditioned over and over and over and over again by, our media and the way that our systems are set up to just care about our own isolated experience in the world.
Yeah, and I think there's one important thing behind that, Mona, that is worth playing out, which is that all of us as individuals are so worthy of God's love as individuals. And there's a truth there that our culture plays with, but it is a very true thing. We are all worthy. And regardless of our behavior, regardless of our choices, we are worthy of God's love. And in so making those choices, we can live into a world where we can experience our worthiness through the relationships with other people. So I think it's we only have one side of the story when we are brought in by our culture. And that can be really, really negative. We need the whole thing.
So the way you're talking about this, I mean, my first response was, can't we just feel God's love in our hearts and that's enough? Does the material world matter? Joe, you have something to say about that?
I do, but why don't you finish your thought?
Well, my thought was, it sounds like what you're saying in the way, and I'm trying to understand how to think more like an organizer, by talking to you guys, but it sounds like what you're saying is, you can boil down all of our social and governmental structures to just describing them in terms of relationship. And that actually could work.
Yeah.
What I want to say, and Mona, while you were, playing devil's advocate, I was hearing the words of some folks that are very close to me, that they will say to me, that's great, Joe, but you're not living in the real world. Seth, I don't know if you ever hear that line. When are you going to live in the real world? That idea that this belief that we could arrive at a global or national community of folks where we really care about people and put that first. The idea that that's just so far-fetched that it's not even possible, so why are you trying, is so crucial to supporting and undergirding those very structures. The idea that they're inevitable, so why resistance is futile, give up. And to which I would say, I can't remember where this quote comes from. I've repeated it so many times, but you make the path by walking, and you make the world you want to live in by living in it. So if you choose to live in that world, then don't be surprised if that's the world that you see. But there is an alternative, and it's harder in some ways, but it's also easier in other ways.
I like that a lot. That's helpful to, I think, like change your thinking over and like, yeah, you have more choice than you realize.
Absolutely. And like Seth said earlier, we can, one by one withdraw our consent from the status quo.
Yeah. So we're wrapping up our time. You guys, this has been an awesome conversation. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you for coming on today. So I want to ask 2 questions. First of all, are there any organizations that you're working on or any projects that you're working on that you want to give a great big shout out to and tell people to go check this out? This is an amazing cause. You should get behind it. Seth, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I would love to shout out to some of my people. The first I'll say is a evangelical network of Christians. It's called the Transform Network. They do really awesome work with a lot of folks from mostly evangelical backgrounds who are trying to move into this world of social justice, this world of organizing, what it might look like. That's a great resource if you're coming from that experience. I am part of a national network of organizers called Momentum, and we train folks who have some experience in community organizing in the nature of popular movements and how do you scale your work from local to national. So anyone that has some experience of organizing, they're really interested in learning more about the history of organizing and also how do we make things to scale, totally check out momentumcommunity.org. And then anyone who's interested in trying to learn more about what organizing is, can I get involved? How do I do it? 2 places to find out. One, the PICO, PICO national group. Just type in pico.org. You'll find the information. There's probably a regional or local affiliate where you live, and they will teach you and train you and bring you in. It's people of faith organizing for justice across the country. And if you're lucky enough to be in the Boston area, you can hit me up at the Leadership Development Initiative. And my email is seth@lditeam.org. And I would love to talk to you.
Awesome. Thank you. How about you, Joe?
So just a few groups to spotlight and to piggyback on Seth's comment about Pico. If you don't have a Pico affiliate where you live, a few other groups that are worth checking out that do similar work. There's IAF, Industrial Areas Foundation, Gamaliel Foundation, which GAMIELIL. Google it; it'll fix it for you. And then also DART, DART, are some other groups. DART in particular is more active in the American South, if that happens to be where you are. Also, if you're in the American South, I would strongly recommend that you check out the Highlander Center in Newmarket, Tennessee, either on the web or even better in person. They're a really great incubator for social justice movements. They're one of the places where the civil rights movement went and kind of got themselves organized. Other places more specific to Nashville that I would highlight, the Scarlett Bennett Center. It was a women's college back in the day, but it is changing its gears, and its latest iteration is trying to lean really heavily into supporting faith-based organizing and other organizing efforts in the Mid-South and also across the South. And then lastly, I would encourage people to check out Surge, SURJ, which is that group I mentioned earlier about organizing white people for our anti-racist work. Probably a surge in your area, so that's worth checking out if you want to specifically focus on that issue of race. And then lastly, ask people to go check out Workers' Dignity at workersdignity.org. We're currently raising funds because we're going to be launching the first ever worker-owned radio station in Nashville, Tennessee. The program is going to be entirely supplied and controlled by workers and their allies here in Nashville. So that's going to be really incredible benefit for just movement work here in Nashville. So I'd ask folks to check those out. And, if you want to ask me some questions, I guess Seth gave his email, I'll give mine out. I'm just joseph.m.sheeran. Sheeran is spelled like Ed Sheeran, @gmail.com.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. This is phenomenal. And I'll put all of those links in the show notes so you can check out if you didn't catch something. And my last question to close this out is this. How do people just start doing this? Can you just start doing this? Can you just jump in somewhere and just start being an organizer?
You can definitely do, I would say you can always build relationships to build power, to make a change. You can always do that. Any context, anytime, you can do that. I would highly suggest finding some training if you want to do more and learn a little bit more, just because it's so hard to do it on your own. And it's so much better to have a community of peers around you doing the work. So that's what I'm going to say. And thank you so much for having me on. I had a great time having this conversation, and I'm sure we'll keep having it.
I hope so. I hope so. Any last words, Joe?
No, I would just reiterate what Seth said, that, anyone can do this work. All it means is gathering people together to address something. But as you said, it's much easier to do it if you've got some training, if you've got some other folks doing the work with you. Having a name can be really helpful sometimes. Just give people a box to put you into. And that's, all that is not necessarily essential to what the project is. What's essential is just the will to make the difference and the time and patience to do it. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, and I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. And I'm glad I got to hear Seth
I'm glad I got to hear you both preach. Seriously, you guys are both phenomenal. I thank you for your work on behalf of all of the world, and and keep it up.
Thank you so much.
All right, cheers.
Have a good one, Mona.
You too. Bye-bye.